in the middle of nowhere, where the wind speaks louder than people, and the land remembers every story ever buried beneath it. There was a woman who had nothing left but survival, and a man who had learned to live without needing anyone at all. She didn't come to the ranch looking for love. She came because she had nowhere else to go. No money, no home, no future she could trust. And he didn't ask for company. Not after loss, not after silence became easier than conversation. But sometimes life doesn't ask permission. Sometimes it places two broken paths in the same place, and forces them to decide whether healing is worth the risk of being hurt again. What begins with a simple offer, "Cook for me and stay," slowly turns into something neither of them expected, a quiet rebuilding of trust, warmth, and the kind of human connection that modern life almost forgot. And in a world where everyone is running from something, what happens when two people finally stop? If you love Western ranch stories filled with slow burn romance, emotional healing, and deep human connection, this channel is made for you. This story is not just about love. It's about dignity, second chances, and the quiet strength of people who survive storms no one sees. Because sometimes the most powerful healing is simply being seen by someone who... Real love doesn't save you. It stands beside you while you learn to save yourself. Don't forget to like, comment your thoughts, and subscribe for more Western romance stories full of heart, truth, and emotional depth.
Rain tapped softly against the windshield of Evelyn Carter's aging Ford sedan, the kind of cold Texas rain that did fall hard enough to clean anything, only enough to make the world feel heavier. The gas station on Route 81 was nearly empty except for a rusted pickup near Pump 3 and a flickering neon sign buzzing above the convenience store window. It was close to midnight. Though Evelyn had stopped paying attention to time sometime after sunset, the dashboard clock no longer mattered when there was nowhere left to be. Her phone vibrated again in the cup holder. She already knew who it was before she looked. Martin Landlord. For a few seconds, she simply stared at the screen while the rain crawled slowly down the glass in crooked little rivers. Then the ringing stopped. A voicemail notification appeared almost immediately after. Evelyn closed her eyes. She did want to listen. Not because she didn't know what it would say, because she did. Outside headlights swept across the parking lot before disappearing back onto the highway. Somewhere beyond the gas station, tires hissed against wet pavement, carrying people home to warm kitchens and sleeping houses and lives that still made sense. Evelyn swallowed hard and pressed. Evelyn, the landlord's tired voice said, "I really need the rent by tomorrow morning. I've already given you extra time. If I don't receive payment, I'll have to move forward." No anger, no cruelty that somehow made it worse. She lowered the phone slowly and rested her forehead against the steering wheel. For weeks now, she had been holding herself together with grocery store coffee, overdue notices, and stubbornness. She, to skip dinners so she could afford gas, told herself things would improve once the diner added more shifts, told herself she was just having a rough season. Everybody had weefs, but rough seasons weren't supposed to last this long. The bank app still sat open on her phone screen. 14.27, that was all she had left after paying for medication and putting $10 in the gas tank 2 days earlier. $14.27 at 48 years old. A bitter laugh almost escaped her, but it collapsed somewhere in her throat. She pressed the heels of her palms against her eyes. Instead, she thought about calling somebody, then remembered there really wasn't anybody left to call. Her mother had been gone 3 years now. Cancer took her slowly, cruelly, and expensively. Evelyn had spent nearly everything caring for her through the final year. Savings disappeared first, then the retirement account. Then the little emergency fund she promised herself never to touch. Her ex-husband had remarried long ago and moved to Arizona with a woman 10 years younger. Her daughter lived in Chicago with a demanding job and 2 small children, already stretched too thin herself. Evelyn never told her how bad things had gotten. A mother wasn't supposed to become another burden, so she kept smiling during phone calls. Kept saying things like, "I'm doing all right, sweetheart." Outside the car, the convenience store door opened with a squeal. A tall man stepped into the rain wearing a tan work jacket and a dark cowboy hat pulled low over his eyes. Broad shoulders, slow movements, the kind of man shaped by years of physical labor instead of gym memberships. He crossed toward the pumps without hurry, carrying a paper cup of coffee in one hand. Evelyn looked away quickly before he noticed her crying. She hated crying in public, hated looking weak even more. The rain grew steadier, drumming softly against the roof while she searched her purse for tissues and came up empty except for receipts and an old lipstick she hadn't worn in months. A knock sounded gently against her driver's side window. She startled. The man from the gas station stood outside, holding another coffee cup and a small paper bag. For a second she considered pretending not to notice him. Instead, she lowered the window halfway. Cold air drifted inside. Up close, the man looked older than she first thought. Late 50s maybe, weathered face. Gray at the edges of his beard, tired eyes that had probably seen plenty and spoken little about it. He held out the coffee and the bag. "You should eat something before driving," he said. His voice was low and rough, softened by age and long days outdoors. "Evelyn, blink pay for that wasn't asking you to." She hesitated before taking the items carefully from his hands. The coffee was still hot enough to warm her fingers through the paper cup. Inside the bag was a breakfast sandwich wrapped in foil, simple, probably nothing special. But the smell alone nearly broke her. "Thank you," she whispered. The man nodded once. No questions, no pity, no awkward sympathy. His eyes drifted briefly toward the steering wheel where her hand still trembled slightly. Then he looked back at her. "Roads get slick this late," he said. "Best not drive tired." It was such an ordinary thing to say, and yet something inside Evelyn cracked quietly open at the kindness of it. Not because he'd bought her food, because he spoke to her like she still mattered, like she wasn't invisible. The man tipped his hat lightly and stepped back toward his truck. Evelyn watched him go through the rain, watched the slow confidence in the way he moved, like somebody who understood hard times without needing them explained. Before climbing into his pickup, he paused and glanced back once. "You take care now, then." He drove off into the darkness beyond the highway lights. For a long moment, Evelyn sat perfectly still. The heater in her car barely worked. Rain blurred the windshield into streaks of silver and red. Somewhere inside the gas station, an old country song played faintly through bad speakers. She unwrapped the sandwich slowly. The first bite was still warm, and suddenly, after weeks of trying so hard not to fall apart, Evelyn lowered her head and cried quietly into the paper bag while the rain kept falling around her car. The next morning arrived gray and bitterly cold. Evelyn Carter woke stiff in the front seat of her car with a cramp running through her neck and lower back. For a few disoriented seconds, she forgot where she was. Then the fogged windows, the cramped steering wheel against her ribs, and the ache in her hips reminded her all at once. She was still parked behind the gas station, off Route 81 Point, still homeless. The rain had stopped sometime before dawn, but the world outside remained wet and colorless. Water dripped steadily from the awning above the convenience store, while 18-wheelers roared past on the highway, spraying mist behind them like smoke. Evelyn rubbed both hands over her face and checked the time on the dashboard clock. 6:12 a.m. She'd have barely slept. Every hour or so, headlights sweeping through the parking lot had startled her awake. At one point, she'd dreamed she was back in her old apartment, standing barefoot in the kitchen while her mother hummed softly in the next room. Waking up inside the cold car afterward had hurt more than she expected. She straightened carefully and winced as her back popped. "Well," she muttered to herself, voice rough from sleep. No point falling apart now. The words sounded stronger than she felt. Her reflection in the rearview mirror looked exhausted. Mascara stains shadowed the skin beneath her eyes, and her hair had flattened awkwardly on one side from sleeping against the window. She searched through her purse for a brush, gave up halfway through, and tied her hair back into a loose knot instead. The coffee cup from the night before still sat in the holder beside her, cold now, but she couldn't bring herself to throw it away yet, not because of the coffee, because someone had handed it to her with kindness. And lately, that felt rare enough to keep. By 7 o'clock, Evelyn had washed her face in the gas station restroom, changed into a clean blouse inside the cramped stall, and started driving toward town with the heater rattling weakly beneath the dashboard. She spent the morning walking from business to business, carrying the same worn leather purse and the same careful smile. At the grocery store, the manager barely glanced at her application before saying they were fully staffed at the moment, At the laundromat, a young woman with bright pink nails told her they were only hiring people available for overnight shifts and heavy lifting. At a roadside motel, the owner scanned Evelyn's resume for less than 10 seconds before offering a polite smile that never reached his eyes. "We'll call you by lunchtime." Evelyn had heard those 3 words so many times they no longer sounded real. Nobody was going to call. They knew it. Still, everyone kept saying it because pretending felt kinder than honesty. Around 1 in the afternoon, Evelyn stopped at a small park near downtown and sat on a bench beneath a leafless tree. She split a stale granola bar in half and saved the second piece for later. A cold wind pushed through the square, carrying the smell of barbecue from somewhere nearby. Across the street, people moved in and out of cafes and hardware stores, wrapped inside ordinary Tuesday routines. Construction workers laughed beside a truck. A mother tugged her little boy across the sidewalk while balancing grocery bags on one arm. Normal life continued around her as if she hadn't just lost hers. That was the strange thing about hardship. Evelyn thought the world didn't pause for it. Cars still moved, stores still opened, people still worried about dinner plans and weather forecasts. Meanwhile, your entire life could quietly collapse inside a single week. She stared down at the remaining half of the granola bar in her hand and suddenly remembered something her mother used to say during hard years. "Pride does to keep you warm, honey." At the time, Evelyn never really understood what that meant. Now she did. By late afternoon, her feet hurt badly enough to make her limp slightly. She returned to her car parked outside another diner where she'd filled out an application an hour earlier. The manager, a tired woman no older than 35, had apologized while handing back the resume. "You've got great experience," she said carefully, "but most of our waitresses move pretty fast around here." Evelyn knew what she really meant: too old, not energetic enough, not fresh enough, not worth training. The humiliation of it settled heavily in her chest as she sat behind the steering wheel, staring through the windshield. She remembered being 22 and believing adulthood eventually became stable, that after enough years of hard work, life soft-done somehow. Nobody warned her how quickly a person could become invisible. Her stomach growled painfully. She checked her wallet. $9 left. Evelyn leaned her head back against the seat and closed her eyes. For one reckless moment, she considered driving to Chicago without telling her daughter beforehand, maybe sleeping on her couch for a while, helping with the kids in exchange for a place to stay. But the thought disappeared almost immediately. Her daughter already worked 12-hour hospital shifts while raising 2 children with a husband constantly away on business. Evelyn couldn't walk into that tiny apartment carrying her failures in cardboard boxes. No, she would figure something out herself. She always had. By the time darkness settled across town, the temperature had dropped sharply again. Evelyn drove slowly back toward her apartment complex with a knot tightening in her stomach the closer she got. Maybe the landlord would give her another day. Maybe she could sell the television. Maybe the moment she pulled into the parking lot, she knew. 2 cardboard boxes sat outside her apartment door beneath the yellow hallway light. Her chest tightened instantly. No. She climbed out of the car too quickly, nearly slipping on wet pavement as she hurried toward the building. The closer she got, the more pieces of her life came into focus: a lamp, winter coats, photo albums, kitchen towels, all packed into boxes like forgotten donations. Evelyn stopped in front of the door and tried her key anyway. Nothing, the lock had already been changed. For a long moment, she simply stood there gripping the doorknob while cold air moved quietly through the hallway. Then the apartment door across from hers opened slightly. Mr. Jenkins, the elderly neighbor who watered plants for everyone during vacations, peeked out awkwardly. "He came by around noon," he said softly. "Left the boxes maybe an hour ago." Evelyn nodded once, unable to trust her voice. "I am sorry, Miss Evelyn." She forced a smile that hurt her face. "It's all right," but it was not really. Because standing there in that narrow hallway, staring at everything she owned, packed into 2 cardboard boxes, Evelyn finally understood something terrifying. This wasn't a rough season anymore. This was her life now, and for the first time in years, she had absolutely no idea what came next. Evelyn Carter spent her second night in the car parked behind a closed feed store just outside town. The temperature dropped harder after midnight. By morning, the inside of the windshield had fogged over completely, and every joint in her body ached from sleeping, folded awkwardly beneath an old coat she kept in the trunk. She woke before sunrise to the sound of trucks grinding down the highway and sat there for a while, rubbing warmth back into her hands. For the first few seconds each morning, there was always confusion. Then reality returned, the boxes in the back seat, the nearly empty gas tank, the same exhausted clothes, the same uncertainty waiting for her outside the windows. Evelyn stared at the pale sky beginning to lighten over the fields and whispered softly to herself, "Just make it through today." It was the kind of thing people said when they'd stopped planning further than 24 hours ahead. By 8 o'clock she was driving slowly through town again, conserving gas by barely touching the heater. The radio played low static between old country songs, and every cafe she passed smelled like bacon and coffee drifting into the cold morning air. She hadn't eaten since half a granola bar the day before. Her stomach twisted painfully each time she caught the smell of breakfast. Eventually, she pulled into the parking lot of a small roadside diner near the edge of town. The sign outside read Mabel's Diner Home, cooking hot coffee. One of the letters in cooking flickered weakly. The place looked old but alive, with pickup trucks already filling most of the gravel lot. Men in work jackets and dusty boots moved in and out carrying thermoses and talking loudly over the sound of diesel engines. Evelyn sat in the car for a moment watching them. Then she checked her wallet again. $6 and some loose change, enough for coffee, maybe toast. Barely still, she could spend another morning. Hungry, the bell above the diner door jingled softly as she stepped inside. Warmth wrapped around her immediately. The smell hit first: fried bacon, butter, black coffee, sausage gravy. Real food. For a dangerous second, Evelyn thought she might cry again. The diner buzzed with low conversation and clattering plates. Waitresses moved quickly between crowded tables while an old George Strait song drifted from a radio somewhere behind the counter. Near the back of the room sat a group of ranch hands in heavy denim jackets, and sitting quietly at the end of the table was the man from the gas station, Wyatt Brooks. He looked up briefly when Evelyn entered. Recognition flickered across his face. Though he didn't smile or wave, he simply tipped his head once in acknowledgement before returning to his coffee. Something about that small gesture calmed her nerves a little. She slid into an empty booth near the window and ordered the cheapest thing on the menu: coffee and toast. The waitress gave her a sympathetic look but didn't comment. Around her, conversations rolled on naturally: cattle prices, weather reports, a truck transmission needing repairs, normal life. Evelyn wrapped both hands round the coffee mug when it arrived. Letting the heat sink into her fingers, she took one slow sip and closed her eyes briefly. God, it tasted good. At the rancher's table, one of the younger workers shoved away his plate with obvious irritation. "I swear, Hank's gonna poison us one day," he grumbled loudly. "Those beans tasted like charcoal last night." A few men chuckled. Another added, "Man can ruin canned soup." Even Wyatt's mouth twitched faintly at that. Without thinking, Evelyn murmured into her coffee, "He's cooking them." The comment slipped out before she realized she'd spoken aloud. The nearest ranch hand looked over. "What?" Evelyn froze slightly, embarrassed. "The beans," she said carefully. "If they reburning, heat's too high. Beans need time more than temperature." A pause. Then one of the older men barked out a laugh. "You hear that, Wyatt? We've been abusing beans all this time." A few others joined in, not mocking, just amused, and for the first time in days, Evelyn felt something unfamiliar move through her chest: normalcy. The waitress passing by smiled at her. "You cook?" Evelyn nodded, lightly, used to. The older ranch hand leaned sideways. "Well, hell, Mom, if you could save Hank's cooking, you'd be doing the Lord's work." More laughter. Even Evelyn smiled a little. It felt strange on her face after so long. Wyatt studied her quietly across the diner. His eyes moved over the careful way she held herself together, the tiredness beneath her makeup, the stiffness in her shoulders. He noticed things most people missed, probably because loneliness recognized itself. A few minutes later, the ranch hands began filing out one by one, tossing cash on the table and pulling on gloves before heading back to work. Wyatt stayed seated. Evelyn focused on her toast, pretending not to notice. When he finally stood and walked toward her booth, he stopped beside the table. "You really know how to cook?" His voice carried the same rough calm she remembered from the gas station. Evelyn looked up carefully. "I raised a family on a grocery budget and church casseroles." That earned the faintest hint of amusement in his eyes. "Can you cook for 12 men, 12 hungry men?" He nodded once. She leaned back slightly. "I probably could." For a moment, Wyatt said nothing. He looked out the diner window toward the gray morning sky, as though considering something carefully before turning back to her. "My cook quit 2 weeks ago," he said. "Since then, the boys have been living on canned chili and burned coffee. That explains the complaints." Another almost smile touched his face. Then he said the words that changed everything. "Cook for me this week." Evelyn blinked. "What you cook, I pay." Simple, direct, no unnecessary explanation. Her first instinct was suspicion. Life had taught her to distrust easy offers. "I didn't have references," she admitted quietly. "Didn't ask for any. I can only work mornings and evenings if you got somewhere else to be." The question landed harder than he intended. Evelyn looked down at the coffee in her hands. Silence stretched briefly between them. Then Wyatt added, almost casually, "There's a spare room at the ranch house if you need a place for a few days." Evelyn looked up sharply. "A place?" The words echoed painfully inside her chest, not because she trusted him immediately, but because she could remember the last time someone offered her safety without expecting something in return. Wyatt seemed to sense her hesitation. "You'd have your own room," he said. "You work, you eat. You stay till you figure things out. No pressure, no charm. No false promises, just practical kindness, and somehow that made it feel real." Evelyn stared down at the last piece of toast on her plate while emotion tightened slowly in her throat. Outside the diner window, wind bent the dry grass along the roadside. Inside, coffee cups clinked softly against ceramic plates, while country music hummed through old speakers overhead. Ordinary sounds, ordinary people. And yet suddenly, for the first time in weeks, Evelyn felt something she'd almost forgotten how to feel. Maybe her life was completely over yet. Wyatt Brooks' ranch sat nearly 40 minutes outside town, far enough that the roads narrowed into long stretches of open land and weathered fence posts. Evelyn followed his pickup truck along a dirt road that cut through miles of dry winter grass, her old sedan rattling every time it hit a pothole. Dust rose behind Wyatt's tires in pale clouds drifting slowly across the fields beneath a cold gray sky. The farther they drove, the quieter the world became. No traffic, no store signs. No apartment buildings stacked shoulder to shoulder, just land, endless Texas land stretching beneath the wide open sky. Evelyn kept both hands tight on the steering wheel as she followed him through the ranch gate. A faded wooden sign read Brooks Cattle Ranch. The paint had begun peeling years ago. Beyond the gate sat a large ranch house, several barns, a corral, and long fences running toward the horizon. Workers moved near the cattle pens in heavy jackets while horses shifted restlessly in the cold wind. The place wasn't fancy, it was worn, hard-used, real, and somehow that made Evelyn trust it more. Wyatt parked near the house and climbed from the truck without hurry. Evelyn stepped out a moment later, pulling her coat tighter around herself as wind swept across the yard. The ranch house stood 2 stories tall with wide porches wrapping around both sides. Time and weather had faded the white paint into soft gray. One porch railing leaned slightly crooked, and one shutter hung unevenly beside an upstairs window. But despite its age, the house felt solid, like something built to survive hard years. Wyatt grabbed Evelyn a small suitcase from her trunk before she could protest. "I can carry that," she said quickly. I know he still carried it anyway. That small detail unsettled her more than if he flirted. Most men either ignored struggling women or treated them like fragile glass. Wyatt did neither. He simply acted like helping was normal. The front porch creaked beneath their boots as he opened the door and stepped aside for her to enter first. Warm air greeted her immediately, carrying the faint smell of coffee, cedarwood, and something older she couldn't quite place. The house was quiet, not peaceful quiet. Lonely quiet, the kind that settles into walls over time. Evelyn stepped inside slowly, taking in the details around her. A long wooden dining table sat near the kitchen with only one chair slightly pulled out, as though someone always ate alone. Old photographs lined the mantel above a stone fireplace. A woman with dark hair smiled from several frames beside a younger version of Wyatt, standing stiffly in work clothes. Family pictures, none recent. The television in the corner looked untouched for years. A folded blanket rested neatly over the couch arm. Boots sat lined beside the door with careful precision. Everything clean, everything orderly. Yet somehow the house still felt empty. Wyatt set her suitcase near the staircase. "Kitchen ass through there," he said. "Bathroom ass at the end of the hall. Your room ass upstairs." Evelyn nodded quietly. He hesitated briefly, before adding, "House was simple, locked at night. Don't worry about the workers coming in early. Most of them know better than to bother anybody before coffee." A faint trace of dry humor touched the sentence, almost enough to make her smile almost. Wyatt gestured toward the kitchen. "There's food in the fridge. You hungry?" The truth was she was starving, but pride answered first. "I'm all right." His eyes rested on her for one long second. Then he said simply, "People usually say that when they knock." Evelyn looked away immediately. The gentleness in his voice somehow made the exhaustion inside her rise dangerously close to the surface. Again, Wyatt didn't press further. He walked to the kitchen instead, opened the refrigerator, and pulled out eggs, bacon, and butter. Like this conversation had already ended. "You can sit," he said. "I can help. You can rest." There was no sharpness in the words, just certainty. Evelyn slowly lowered herself into one of the kitchen chairs while Wyatt moved quietly around the stove. She watched him crack eggs one-handed into a skillet with the ease of long habit. His movements were efficient, economical. A man used to doing things himself, because there'd been nobody else around to do them for a long time. The silence between them should have felt awkward. Instead, it felt strangely safe. Outside the kitchen window, wind bent the dry grass near the fence line while clouds rolled low over distant hills. For the first time in days, Evelyn wasn't calculating where she could park overnight. That realization hit her harder than expected. Wyatt placed a plate in front of her a few minutes later, eggs, bacon, toast, simple food, but hot, real. Evelyn stared down at it for a moment longer than necessary. "You don't have to look so suspicious," Wyatt muttered while pouring coffee into 2 mugs. A quiet laugh escaped her before she could stop it. It startled both of them. The sound felt rusty, like something unused for years. Wyatt glanced toward her briefly, and for the first time she noticed how tired he looked too, not physically. Something deeper than that, like a man who had spent too many years waking up to silence. They ate mostly without conversation. Not uncomfortable silence, just 2 weary adults too tired to perform for each other. Eventually Wyatt pushed his empty plate aside. "Room upstairs is the second door, on the left," he said. "Bathroom, stocked with clean towels." Evelyn hesitated before speaking. "Why are you doing this?" The question lingered in the kitchen quietly. Wyatt rubbed one rough hand across his jaw before answering. "You needed work." "That's not what I meant." Another pause. Finally, he shrugged lightly. "Worless, what hard enough already." The simplicity of the answer left her unexpectedly emotional. No speeches about kindness. No savior complex. No hidden agenda. Just a man acknowledging reality. World's hard enough already. Evelyn swallowed hard and looked down at her coffee cup before he noticed the sudden shine in her eyes. After breakfast, Wyatt headed back outside to work cattle, while Evelyn carried her suitcase upstairs. The hallway creaked softly beneath her feet. Her room was small but warm, with faded floral curtains and a quilt folded neatly across the bed. Sunlight pushed weakly through the windows, illuminating tiny dust particles drifting in the air. A rocking chair sat in one corner beside a bookshelf half-filled with old paperbacks. The room clearly hadn't been used much lately. Still, it was clean. Safe, quiet. Evelyn closed the door behind her and stood perfectly still in the middle of the room. Then slowly, carefully, she sat on the edge of the bed. The mattress dipped softly beneath her weight. For several seconds she simply stared at her hands resting in her lap. No landlord banging on walls. No fear of police tapping on car windows. No wondering where she'd sleep tonight. Just stillness. And somehow, after weeks of chaos, stillness felt almost unbearable. Her chest tightened unexpectedly. Before she realized it, tears blurred her vision again. Not dramatic crying, just silent tears sliding down exhausted cheeks, because safety can break a person apart almost as quickly as fear, especially after they've gone without it for too long. Downstairs, she heard the front door open and close again as workers moved in and out of the ranch house. Men laughed faintly outside near the barns. Somewhere in the distance, cattle lowed against the wind. Life continued here. Steady, routine, grounded. Evelyn wiped her face quickly before lying back carefully against the pillows. She only meant to rest for a minute, but the warmth of the room, the softness of the mattress, and the deep exhaustion in her bones pulled her under almost instantly. When she woke again, pale evening light filled the room. For one temporary second she panicked, unsure where she was. Then the scent reached her: coffee, wood smoke, dinner cooking downstairs, home smells. Evelyn sat up slowly. The realization hit her quietly but powerfully. This house wasn't happy, not yet, but it wasn't dead either. Something inside it still wanted warmth, and maybe so did the man living here. Evelyn woke to the sound of boots thudding across the porch downstairs, and men laughing somewhere outside the kitchen window. For one soft, disoriented moment, she forgot where she was. Then the smell reached her: coffee, fresh coffee, and underneath it, wood smoke drifting faintly through the old house. She blinked slowly against the pale morning light filling the bedroom curtains. The bed beneath her still felt unfamiliar in the strange way safe places often did after too many restless nights. Her body had sunk so deeply into sleep, she hadn't even remembered taking off her shoes before collapsing across the quilt the evening before. Outside, engines rumbled awake near the barns. Ranch life started early. Evelyn sat up carefully and checked the small clock beside the bed. 5:18 a.m. Lord, she hadn't meant to sleep. That long embarrassment warmed her immediately. Wyatt had hired her to cook. and she'd apparently spent half her first day unconscious upstairs like an exhausted stray cat. She hurried to the bathroom, splashed cold water on her face, tied her hair back, and pulled on the cleanest clothes she had left. By the time she reached the kitchen downstairs, the ranch house already carried the low lived-in sounds of morning. Coffee poured into mugs, chairs scraping wood floors, men speaking in rough half-awake voices. The moment Evelyn stepped into the kitchen, conversation dipped briefly. 5 ranch hands sat around the long dining table nursing coffee before heading outside. Most looked somewhere between 40 and 60, weathered by sun and hard labor. Thick jackets hung over chairs. Gloves rested beside plates dusted with biscuit crumbs. At the stove, Wyatt stood flipping bacon in a cast-iron skillet. He glanced over his shoulder when she entered. "You missed sunrise," he said. There was no irritation in his voice. "Just fact, I am sorry," Evelyn said quickly. "I didn't mean to. You looked like you needed sleep more than cooking." One of the older workers snorted softly. "That bad, boss?" Wyatt ignored him. Evelyn stood awkwardly near the doorway for a second. Before instinct finally took over, she moved toward the stove automatically, reaching for another skillet. "You re-burning the bacon," she muttered. That earned a few chuckles around the table. Wyatt stepped aside without argument. "Be my guest." The kitchen shifted almost immediately as one started moving through it, not dramatically, just naturally. She found herself opening cabinets, locating spices, checking the refrigerator contents like she'd done this same dance 1,000 times before in kitchens all over her life. Eggs, potatoes, butter, onions, a package of sausage, simple ingredients enough. The men at the table watched quietly while she diced potatoes into a hot skillet. The smell of onions and butter filled the room within minutes, rich and warm against the cold morning air still clinging to everyone's jackets. One of the younger ranch hands leaned back in his chair. "Smells better already." "Everything smells better than burnt bacon," another muttered. Wyatt poured himself more coffee but said nothing. Still, Evelyn noticed he stayed in the kitchen longer than necessary instead of heading outside with the others. The rhythm returned to her faster than expected. Cooking always had, not because she was professionally trained, not because she'd ever dreamed of becoming a chef. Cooking was simply the language her generation of women learned when words failed. You fed people when they were grieving, fed them when they were scared, fed them when money was tight, fed them because sometimes a hot meal was the only kindness you could afford to give. By 6 o'clock, plates covered the table, fried potatoes, eggs, sausage, fresh biscuits made from scratch. The room fell almost completely silent once the men started eating. Not polite silence, hungry silence, real silence. Evelyn stayed near the stove, pretending to wipe counters while nervousness tightened in her stomach. Maybe the food wasn't as good as she remembered. Maybe she'd lost her touch. Then one of the ranch hands, a gray-haired man, everyone called Earl, lowered his fork slowly and looked up. "Well, I'll be damned." Another man pointed toward the biscuit basket. "Miss, did you make these from scratch?" Evelyn nodded cautiously. Earl took another bite before speaking again. "Haven't had food like this since my wife passed." The sentence settled softly across the room. Nobody laughed after that. Nobody rushed to fill the silence either. Because every man at that table understood exactly what he meant. Not just the taste, the feeling. The warmth of food made by somebody who cared whether you ate. Evelyn looked down quickly, suddenly emotional again for reasons she couldn't fully explain. Across the kitchen, Wyatt watched her quietly over the rim of his coffee mug. Something changed in the room that morning. Subtle, invisible, almost but real. The ranch house no longer felt entirely empty. After breakfast, the men headed back outside one by one, pulling on jackets and thanking Evelyn awkwardly as they left. "Appreciate the meal. Ma, best breakfast I've had in months. You saved us from Hank's cooking." That last one drew laughter again. Soon only Wyatt remained in the kitchen. He stood near the sink, rinsing coffee grounds from the pot while Evelyn gathered plates. "You don't have to clean everything yourself," he said. "I know." She continued stacking dishes anyway. Old habits. People who spent years taking care of others rarely knew how to sit still. For a while, only the sound of running water filled the room. Then Wyatt spoke again without looking at her. "Earl's wife died 3 winters ago." Evelyn glanced up. "He does talk about her," Wyatt continued. "Hasn't eaten breakfast at home since." Something tightened quietly in Evelyn's chest. He seemed lonely. His answer came too fast, too certain, as if Wyatt understood loneliness better than most. Evelyn dried her hands slowly on a dish towel. "So are you." The words slipped out before she could stop them. For the first time since meeting him, Wyatt looked caught off guard, not offended, just unprepared. He leaned one hand against the counter and stared toward the window over the sink where cold wind pushed against the pasture grass outside. Finally he shrugged, lightly. Comes with the territory. No, Evelyn said softly, it comes with losing people. The kitchen grew still again. Wyatt's jaw tightened almost invisibly. Evelyn immediately regretted saying it. She crossed a line. But instead of shutting down, Wyatt surprised her. My wife used to sing while she cooked, he said quietly. Evelyn blinked. It was the first personal thing he'd shared about himself. She wasn't very good at it. He added after a moment, same 3 songs over and over. A small smile touched the corner of his mouth before fading almost immediately. How long has she been gone? Evelyn asked gently. 8 years. 8 years. Long enough for grief to settle deep into the structure of a person's life. Long enough to forget what companionship sounded like. Wyatt cleared his throat and straightened slightly, as though realizing he'd said more than intended. You'll need grocery supplies if you're recooking dinner too, he muttered. And just like that, the moment closed again, but not completely. Something had shifted. Evelyn felt it. Later that afternoon, while Wyatt worked fences with the ranch hands, Evelyn stayed inside reorganizing the kitchen shelves, not because anyone asked her to, because the house itself seemed tired. The spice cabinet held expired seasoning from years ago. Dish towels sat stiff and unused in drawers. Half the pantry was filled with canned soup and boxed potatoes, survival food. Food made by people too lonely to care what dinner tasted like. She opened windows briefly to let fresh air move through the rooms, wiped dust from the radio near the counter, found an old ceramic bowl, and filled it with oranges from the refrigerator simply because color made spaces feel warmer. Small things. But homes were built from small things. As evening approached, Evelyn started dinner. Chicken fried steak, mashed potatoes, cream gravy, green beans with bacon. Peach cobbler cooling near the window, the smell spread through the ranch house long before sunset. By the time Boots started stomping across the porch again after dark, the entire kitchen glowed with warmth and light. The workers entered talking loudly until the smell hit them. Then conversation stopped almost immediately. One of the younger men inhaled dramatically. Sweet Lord. Earl removed his hat slowly and stared toward the stove. Miss Evelyn, he said seriously, you trying to make grown men cry in here? Laughter filled the room. Real laughter this time. Not forced. Not polite, the kind that comes from people relaxing without realizing it. Wyatt entered last, brushing cold air from his jacket as he stepped inside. His eyes moved across the kitchen, the steaming food, the crowded table, the laughter, the warm lights reflecting off old wooden walls. For several seconds he simply stood there quietly taking it all in, and Evelyn realized something then. This ranch hadn't only been missing good food, it had been missing life. Wyatt finally removed his gloves. Slowly. Smells dangerous in here. Evelyn smiled before she could stop herself. Sit down before the gravy gets cold. Something flickered briefly across Wyatt's face at those words, something soft, almost unfamiliar, as if nobody had told him to sit down and simply be cared for in a very long time. By the end of Evelyn Carter's first full week at Brooks Ranch, the house no longer sounded empty. That was the first thing Wyatt noticed, not the food, not the cleaner kitchen, not even the fact that his ranch hands had suddenly stopped complaining during meals. It was the sound. Cabinet doors opening in the mornings, soft footsteps upstairs, the quiet hum of someone moving through the kitchen before sunrise, sometimes Evelyn humming under her breath without realizing it. Little sounds, human sounds, the kind a lonely house forgets after enough years. Wyatt stood outside the barn just after dawn watching cold steam rise from the horses' backs while the ranch hands loaded feed into the truck beds. Frost still clung to the fence rails beneath the pale morning light, and somewhere near the pasture gate Earl was arguing with a younger worker about a broken latch. Ordinary ranch chaos. But through the open kitchen window drifting across the yard came the smell of cinnamon and coffee. Wyatt paused without meaning. Cinnamon, he couldn't remember the last time this place smelled like something baked instead of reheated. Earl noticed him standing there. You planning on working today, boss, or just sniffing the air like an old bloodhound? A few men laughed. Wyatt shot him a dry look. Careful, Earl, you be getting too cheerful in your old age. That's because Miss Evelyn feeds us like human beings. The others agreed loudly. Wyatt ignored them and headed toward the house before they noticed the faintest hint of amusement pulling at his mouth. Inside, the kitchen glowed with soft yellow light against the cold blue morning outside the windows. Evelyn stood near the stove, wearing one of Wyatt's old flannel shirts rolled at the sleeves over jeans. Her hair was loosely tied back, and flour dusted one side of the counter beside a tray of cinnamon biscuits cooling beneath a towel. She looked up when Wyatt entered. "You late," she said casually. Wyatt blinked once, not because of the words, because nobody had said something that normal to him in years. Most people spoke to him carefully, respectfully at a distance. Evelyn simply spoke to him like he was another tired person standing in a kitchen before work. "Cattle got high near the south fence," he replied. "You still have time for breakfast." The sentence landed strangely deep in his chest. Still have time for breakfast, as if meals mattered, as if he mattered. Wyatt removed his glove slowly and sat at the table while Evelyn poured coffee into his mug, without asking how he took it anymore. Black. 2 sugars, she'd already remembered. The realization unsettled him slightly, not because it was intrusive, because it felt good. And Wyatt Brooks had spent many years distrusting things that felt good. Evelyn placed a plate in front of him: scrambled eggs, sausage, fried potatoes, and one warm cinnamon biscuit glazed lightly with honey butter. Wyatt stared at the biscuit for a second. "My wife used to make something like these," he said quietly before taking a bite. Evelyn pretended not to notice how long it took him to swallow afterward. Outside, truck engines started again while boots crossed the porch one by one as workers piled into the kitchen. Within minutes, the room filled with noise and warmth. "Morning, Miss Eve. Something smells illegal in here. You spoil us anymore and nobody is ever leaving." Evelyn laughed softly while sliding plates across the counter. The nickname had stuck now, Miss Eve. And somehow it fit her better than Evelyn ever had. For years she'd felt invisible everywhere she went. Another middle-aged woman standing quietly in grocery store lines and waiting rooms, easy to overlook. But here, every morning somebody smiled when she walked into the room. The feeling frightened her a little, because people only became dangerous once they started mattering. By late afternoon, clouds rolled heavily over the ranch, carrying the promise of rain. Wyatt and the ranch hands spent most of the day repairing fencing before the weather turned worse, finally returning exhausted and mud-covered just before sunset. Evelyn heard them before she saw them. Truck doors slamming, boots on the porch. Low, tired voices. She wiped her hands on a kitchen towel and glanced toward the oven clock. Perfect timing. Dinner sat ready. Pot roast slow-cooked for hours, buttered carrots, cornbread, an apple cobbler warming gently beside the stove. The moment the workers entered, Earl stopped mid-sentence and inhaled deeply. "Oh, now that ain't right," he groaned dramatically. "Woman's trying to kill us with comfort." The younger men laughed while stripping off jackets. Wyatt entered last, shoulders stiff from cold and labor. Dirt streaked one sleeve of his coat, and exhaustion lined his face deeper than usual. Evelyn noticed immediately. "You hurt your shoulder again?" she asked. Wyatt looked mildly surprised. "What? You're holding your arm stiff." He glanced down briefly before shrugging. "Just sore," Earl snorted while reaching for cornbread. "That means," Evelyn pointed toward a chair, "sit." Wyatt raised an eyebrow. "You ordering me around in my own house now?" "Yes." A few ranch hands nearly choked, trying not to laugh. To everyone's surprise, including his own, Wyatt sat down without argument. Dinner unfolded louder than usual that night. Stories bounced around the table while rain finally began tapping steadily against the windows outside. One worker complained about his ex-wife's lawyer. Another swore a calf nearly broke his leg earlier that afternoon. Earl exaggerated a story so badly that even Wyatt muttered, "That is not remotely how it happened." Laughter filled the room again. Evelyn moved quietly between stove and table refilling plates, while warmth spread through the old ranch house like something waking from a long sleep. At one point she caught Wyatt watching the room silently. Not eating, just watching. There was something almost stunned in his expression. As though he could quite believe this noise belonged inside his house again. After dinner, most of the workers lingered longer than usual instead of rushing home immediately. Earl stayed nearly 40 extra minutes drinking coffee and talking about cattle prices while 2 younger ranch hands argued over football near the fireplace. Nobody seemed eager to leave. The storm outside gave them an excuse. But Evelyn sensed it was more than weather. People stayed where they felt warmth. Eventually, the workers headed out one by one into the rain until only Wyatt and Evelyn remained. The kitchen had grown quiet again except for soft country music drifting from the old radio Evelyn had cleaned earlier that week. Wyatt stood at the sink rinsing dishes while Evelyn dried them beside him. Rain tapped steadily against the windows, For a long while neither spoke, then Wyatt finally said they haven't stayed after dinner like that in years. Evelyn handed him another plate carefully. Maybe they missed feeling at home. Wyatt's hands paused briefly beneath the running water. Home, the word hung in the kitchen softly, dangerously, because neither of them wanted to admit how badly they both missed it too. A loud crack of thunder rolled across the ranch suddenly, shaking the windows hard enough to startle Evelyn. One of the kitchen lights flickered briefly. "You afraid of storms?" Wyatt asked. "No," she lied automatically. Another thunderclap answered almost immediately. "You jumped." "I did not." "You absolutely did." Evelyn narrowed her eyes slightly. "You enjoying this?" "A little." The faint trace of humor in his voice surprised both of them. Then the power suddenly went out. The kitchen dropped into darkness except for weak lightning flashes outside the windows. "Well," Wyatt muttered calmly, "there goes the transformer again." Evelyn laughed softly despite herself. "Please tell me this isn't normal, only when it rains. In other words, yes." Wyatt disappeared briefly into the hallway before returning with 2 oil lamps. He lit them carefully, one at a time, warm golden light filling the kitchen in soft flickers. The entire room changed instantly beneath the lamplight. Softer, older, more intimate. Outside, rain hammered the roof while wind rattled tree branches near the porch. Inside, the world narrowed down to warm light, coffee cups, and 2 tired people standing shoulder to shoulder at the sink. For a long moment, neither moved. Then Evelyn looked around the dim kitchen and smiled quietly. "This house feels different now." Wyatt leaned against the counter, studying her carefully across the flickering light. "Different, good." Evelyn nodded. "Yes." Wyatt looked toward the dining room, where empty coffee cups still sat scattered across the long wooden table. For years that room had only held silence. Now there were fingerprints on glasses, crumbs on plates, laughter lingering faintly in the walls. Life. Real life. Finally he looked back at her and said something so quietly she almost missed it. "Been a long time since this place felt lived in." The honesty in his voice caught her off guard. Not polished honesty, not dramatic vulnerability, just a tired man speaking the truth because he no longer had the energy to hide it. Evelyn swallowed softly, and somewhere deep inside her chest, something lonely answered back. Wyatt Brooks stopped talking about his wife the moment the kitchen lights flickered back on that night, not because he regretted it, but because some truths, once spoken, changed the air in a room too much to ignore. And Wyatt had spent years learning how to live in silence without letting it break him. The morning after the storm, Brooks Ranch looked washed clean. The fences glistened with leftover rain, and the ground still held deep hoofprints, filled with muddy water. The air smelled sharper than usual, like the world had been reset overnight, and didn't quite know what version of itself it was supposed to be yet. Evelyn was already in the kitchen when Wyatt came in from the barn. She stood at the stove in a simple cotton shirt, sleeves rolled, stirring a pot of coffee and humming faintly to herself without realizing it. The sound was soft, almost absent-minded, like something that had lived inside her for years and only now found to come out again. Wyatt paused just inside the doorway. He didn't interrupt her, he just listened, because he couldn't remember the last time his house had music that wasn't coming from a radio. Evelyn turned slightly when she sensed him there. "You re early," she said. Wyatt nodded. "Once asleep, that makes 2 of us." She poured him coffee without asking, already knowing how he took it, black, no sugar. The mug warmed his hands in a way he didn't expect to notice, but did anyway. They sat at the table longer than usual that morning, not talking much, just existing in the same quiet space without tension. That alone felt like progress. Outside, ranch hands were already loading feed and arguing lightly about broken equipment. Life on the ranch moved forward with its usual rough rhythm, but inside the house, something subtler had begun to shift. Wyatt noticed it in small ways. The smell of real meals instead of reheated leftovers. Clean counters where dust used to settle, fresh flowers in a mason jar by the window that he hadn't seen her put there. And Evelyn moving through his kitchen like she belonged to it without asking permission. That last part unsettled him more than anything, because belonging was dangerous. Belonging meant loss could happen again. Around mid-morning, Wyatt found her outside near the porch steps, sorting through an old crate of tools left behind from the previous owner of the ranch. She had a dust rag in one hand, wiping down a rusted lantern carefully like it mattered. "You don't have to clean everything you see," he said from behind her. Evelyn didn't turn around immediately. "I'm not cleaning," she replied. "I'm bringing things back to life." That answer stayed with him longer than he expected. Bringing things back to life. Wyatt leaned against the porch post, watching her for a moment. There was something steady about the way she worked. Not frantic. Not trying to fix everything at once. Just patient effort, like she understood that healing took time and repetition. Finally, he spoke again. "You ever think about leaving?" The question came out more direct than he intended. Evelyn paused, cloth still in her hand. "Leaving the ranch anywhere," Wyatt said. "Starting over somewhere else." She thought about it longer than most people would expect. Then she shook her head slightly. "I used to think starting over meant running away from what hurt you," she said quietly. "Now I think it just means learning how to stand somewhere without falling apart." Wyatt didn't respond right away. "Because that wasn't the kind of answer you argued with. That was the kind of answer you carried with you." A long silence settled between them. Comfortable in a way silence hadn't been for Wyatt in years. Then Evelyn added, "Why do you ask?" Wyatt shifted his weight slightly, no reason, but she didn't press him. That was something else he wasn't used to. Most people either avoided questions entirely or demanded answers immediately. Evelyn did neither. She just let things exist without forcing them to become more than they were ready to be. By afternoon, the ranch hands had returned from fixing a broken section of fencing near the east pasture. Earl came into the kitchen first, stomping mud off his boots and immediately sniffing the air like a man tracking comfort. "If that's what I think it is," he said, "I might just retire right here in your kitchen, Miss Eve." Evelyn smiled slightly without looking up from the cutting board. "It's stew," she said. "Bless you." The room filled quickly again with noise, laughter, and the heavy sounds of boots moving across wooden floors. Plates were set down. Coffee was poured. Someone turned the radio on low in the corner. But it barely mattered because the house itself had become louder in its own way. Wyatt stood near the doorway watching it all again. He kept doing that lately, watching, noticing as if afraid it might disappear if he looked away too long. Evelyn noticed him too. "You are not eating," she said when she passed him a bowl. "I will, you say that every time." A faint flicker of something like amusement crossed his face. "Habit. Bad one." Wyatt took the bowl anyway. Their fingers brushed briefly. It was nothing, and yet it wasn't tea. Something small and unspoken passed between them. In that moment, something neither of them named, but both of them felt. After dinner, most of the ranch hands left earlier than usual, satisfied and tired in the best possible way. Earl lingered behind longer than the rest, sitting on the porch with a cup of coffee and talking about weather patterns like he had nowhere better to be. Inside the kitchen, Evelyn washed dishes while Wyatt dried them beside her again. They had fallen into that rhythm without discussing it. One washing, one drying. Neither questioning why it felt natural. "You ever miss it?" Evelyn asked suddenly. Wyatt glanced at her. "Miss what, your wife?" The question wasn't sharp, just honest. Wyatt looked down at the plate in his hands for a long moment. Then he answered carefully. "Every day," he said, "just not in the same way anymore." Evelyn did interrupt. She just waited. Wyatt set the plate aside. "At first it was loud," he continued quietly. "Everything reminded me of her, the house." The silence, even the damn coffee cups. A pause. Then it got quieter, not better. He leaned one hand against the counter, and after a while, I started forgetting what it felt like to have someone in the room with me. Evelyn's voice softened. "That sounds lonely." Wyatt gave a small, tired nod. It was another pause stretched between them, then Evelyn said something she did plan. "You're not alone now." The words hung in the air. Simple, unforced, but heavy. Wyatt looked at her for a long moment like he was trying to understand whether she meant it literally or emotionally or something in between. Finally he said, "That's a dangerous thing to say to someone like me." Evelyn tilted her head slightly. "Why? Because people leave," he said quietly. "They always do." The honesty in his voice wasn't bitter, just factual, like something he had learned too many times to argue with anymore. Evelyn turned off the water slowly and faced him. "Not everyone leaves," she said. Wyatt didn't answer, but he did disagree either. Outside, the wind moved across the ranch again, brushing through the grass like a slow breath across something old and alive. Inside the kitchen, the silence between them didn't feel empty anymore. It felt like something still being written. Evelyn Carter had been at Brooks Ranch for just over 3 weeks when she received the letter that changed everything. It arrived on a cold morning that felt no different from any other morning, their coffee brewing in the kitchen, boots crossing the porch, distant cattle lowing across the fields, but something about the envelope sitting on the counter beside her cutting board made the air feel tighter, like the house itself had noticed it before she did. Wyatt had already left for the east pasture. The ranch hands were out checking a broken water line. Evelyn was alone in the kitchen, rolling dough for bread, when she saw her name printed neatly across the front of the envelope. No return address she recognized, just a local town postmark. She wiped her hand slowly on a towel before opening it. Inside was a job offer, a real one. Not a "will call you," not a polite rejection, not silence disguised as kindness. A regional restaurant group in a neighboring town was opening a new location and needed an experienced cook for a long-term position. The pay was steady, the hours predictable. There was even mention of employee housing. For a moment Evelyn didn't move. She just stood there holding the paper while the smell of fresh bread filled the kitchen, and the house around her continued its quiet morning life. Stable work security, a place of her own again. Everything she had been missing before she arrived here. Her first instinct was relief. Her second instinct was something she didn't expect. Hesitation. That feeling unsettled her more than the offer itself, because hesitation meant attachment, and attachment meant risk. Outside, wind pressed lightly against the kitchen window, while she sat down slowly at the table, the letter still in her hands. For years she had learned to make decisions quickly when survival was involved. You don't overthink when you're trying to keep a roof over your head. You just move. You adapt, you leave when you have to. But this was different. It wasn't survival anymore. It was something dangerously close to peace. When Wyatt returned that afternoon, Evelyn was still in the same chair, the letter folded neatly beside her untouched coffee. He noticed immediately that something was off. "You didn't cook yet," he said, setting his gloves down near the door. "I will." But her voice wasn't steady. Wyatt studied her for a moment before walking into the kitchen. He didn't ask right away. That was one of the things she was beginning to understand about him. He didn't rush into other people's test emotions. He waited for them to surface on their own. What happened? Evelyn hesitated, then she slid the letter across the table. Wyatt picked it up and read it without expression, his face unreadable in the way ranchers often were when processing things that didn't involve cattle or fences or weather. When he finished, he placed it back down carefully. "That's a good opportunity," he said. "It wasn't what she expected, I know," Evelyn replied softly. A pause stretched between them. Then Wyatt added, "You should take it if you want it." Those words landed heavier than anything else in the room. Evelyn looked down at her hands. "I don't know what I want," she admitted. That was the first time she had said it out loud. Wyatt leaned back slightly in his chair. "That's honest," he said quietly. Outside, a truck engine started somewhere near the barn. The ranch continued moving, even while the kitchen stayed still. Evelyn finally looked up at him. "What would you do?" she asked. Wyatt didn't answer immediately. He looked toward the window instead, where the field stretched out under a pale winter sky. "I think about what I can lose," he said finally, "and what I can afford to lose." The words settled between them like dust. Evelyn understood what he meant without him needing to say more. That night, dinner was quieter than usual. Not uncomfortable, just thoughtful. The ranch hands noticed it immediately, though none of them commented directly. Earl made a joke about overcooked potatoes, but even he softened his tone when Evelyn didn't laugh as easily as she normally would. Wyatt watched her more than usual during the meal, not staring, just observing like a man trying to understand in a storm before it arrived. After the workers left and the kitchen emptied, Evelyn stayed behind to clean while Wyatt leaned against the counter again. "You thinking about leaving?" he asked eventually. Evelyn didn't deny it. "I don't know," she said. "That usually means yes." "Not always." Wyatt nodded slowly. Then he said something that surprised both of them. "If you stay here long enough," he said, "you start to feel like this place belongs to you." Evelyn looked at him. "And that's bad?" Wyatt's jaw tightened slightly. "It is if you ever have to leave it." The honesty in his voice was quiet but absolute. Evelyn turned off the sink and faced him fully. "Wyatt, what is this place to you?" He hesitated. That hesitation mattered. Finally he answered, "It's the only place I've had that didn't disappear on me." The words were simple, but they carried weight that neither of them ignored. For a long time after that, neither of them spoke. Only the sound of water dripping from the faucet filled the kitchen. Over the next several days, the job offer remained on the counter like a second presence in the house. Evelyn didn't mention it again, neither did Wyatt, but both of them moved around it carefully, like something fragile that might break if touched too directly. Evelyn cooked breakfast every morning, but she started noticing small details she hadn't before. The way Wyatt lingered in doorways longer than necessary. The way he checked on workers twice instead of once. The way he drank his coffee slower, like he was trying to stretch time without admitting it. And Wyatt noticed something in her too. She wasn't just cooking anymore. She was deciding. One evening, as the sun dropped low over the fields and the ranch hands had already gone home, Evelyn stood outside near the porch steps, watching the horizon fade into soft gold and gray. Wyatt joined her quietly after a few minutes. "You going to take it?" he asked. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she looked out at the ranch, at the fences she had helped repair, at the kitchen window glowing faintly behind them, at the barn lights flickering on as dusk settled in. "I could have stability there," she said finally. Wyatt nodded. "Yes, a pause, and here?" she asked. Wyatt didn't respond immediately, because that was the question neither of them wanted to answer too quickly. Finally he said, "Here is just a ranch." Evelyn looked at him. But he wasn't finished. Then he added quietly, "But it feels like something more when you re in it." The wind moved between them softly. Evelyn felt her throat tighten, not from sadness exactly, but from the strange pressure of having two lives open in front of her at the same time. One safe, in a predictable way, the other uncertain, in a way that had somehow become familiar. That night she didn't sleep much, and neither did Wyatt, because both of them understood the same truth without ever saying it aloud. Decisions like this were never really about jobs, they were about people. And what it meant to stay when leaving would be easier. That morning, Brooks Ranch felt like it was holding its breath. Evelyn Carter noticed it the moment she stepped into the kitchen before sunrise. The air was still, almost unnaturally so, like even the house was waiting for something it already understood was coming. The coffee had finished brewing, but she didn't pour herself a cup right away. Instead, she stood by the counter with her hands resting lightly on the edge, staring out the window where the first pale line of daylight was just beginning to stretch across the horizon. Somewhere in the distance, a rooster called out. A truck engine started up near the barn. Life on the ranch was continuing as always, steady and familiar, but inside her chest everything felt uncertain. The letter was still upstairs, unpacked suitcase, half open in her mind, and a decision she had been avoiding for days was now pressing against her thoughts with quiet insistence. Wyatt had not spoken much the night before after their conversation. Not because he was angry or distant, but because something in what she had said had settled inside him too deeply for easy replies. He had simply nodded once, poured another glass of water, and gone outside to check the fences as if the ranch itself needed him more than words did. Evelyn understood that kind of silence. It wasn't avoidance, it was feeling too much at once. She finally poured herself coffee and stepped out onto the back porch. The cold morning air wrapped around her immediately, sharp enough to wake every tired corner of her body. She leaned lightly against the railing and looked out across the open land. It was beautiful in a way that didn't demand attention, just existed. Patient, wide, honest. Behind her the back door creaked open. Wyatt stepped out carrying his jacket in one hand. He hadn't shaved yet, and there was a trace of exhaustion in his eyes that didn't belong to lack of sleep alone. Neither of them spoke immediately. That had become their language, quiet first, words later. The wily Wyatt joined her at the railing, standing a short distance away, but close enough that she could feel his presence. "You caught up?" Evelyn gave a small nod. "Couldn't to sleep." Wyatt looked out toward the fields. Same. Another pause stretched between them, but this one felt heavier than usual. Not uncomfortable, just full of everything they hadn't said out loud. Yet Evelyn turned the coffee mug slowly in her hands. "I made a decision," she said quietly. Wyatt responded immediately. He'd look at her either. But she could feel the slight shift in his posture, like he was bracing for something he already understood. Finally he said, "About the job." Evelyn nodded. Yes. The wind moved gently across the porch, brushing against the wooden posts and carrying the faint smell of wet earth from last night's dew. Wyatt took a slow breath. "What did you decide?" he asked. Evelyn hesitated, but because saying it out loud made it real. "I am not taking it," she said. The words settled into the morning air without drama. No music, no sudden reaction, just truth. Wyatt didn't speak right away. He just kept looking out at the land as if trying to understand what part of it had changed. After a moment, he finally said, "You sure?" Evelyn nodded again. Yes. A longer silence followed this time. Not empty, just significant. Then Wyatt looked at her. Really looked at her. And for the first time since she had arrived at the ranch, there was no distance in his eyes, no careful restraint, no guarded neutrality. Just something raw and unhidden. "You'd have to stay here because of me," he said quietly. Evelyn shook her head slightly. "I know then why." The question was simple again. But this time, it didn't feel like a test, it felt like understanding. Evelyn took a breath before answering. Because I spent most of my life running towards stability that never felt like mine, she said. And I finally realized stability is to just a place where things are safe. She looked down at her coffee for a moment. It is a place where you seen. The words hung between them, still honest, unprotected. Wyatt's jaw tightened slightly like he was trying to hold something steady inside himself. You think this place sees you? He asked. Evelyn nodded. Yes, another pause. Then Wyatt asked the question he had been avoiding since the letter arrived. And what do you think you see here? Evelyn didn't answer immediately. She looked out at the ranch instead, at the barns in the distance, at the fence line stretching toward the horizon, at the quiet world that had slowly, without permission or expectation, become part of her mornings. Then she looked back at him. I see a man who forgot how to ask for company, she said softly. Wyatt didn't react outwardly, but something in his expression shifted, because she wasn't wrong. Evelyn stepped a little closer, and I see a place that stopped trying to be a home, she added, until someone started treating it like one again. Wyatt looked down briefly, then back at her. And you think that someone is you? Evelyn gave a faint, tired smile. I think I just stopped treating it like it didn't matter. The wind picked up slightly, moving across the porch in slow waves. For a long moment neither of them spoke. Then Wyatt finally said, You realize what staying here means, don't you? Evelyn met his gaze directly. I think I am starting to. Another silence followed, but this one felt different, less uncertain, more grounded. Wyatt nodded once slowly. Then you should know something, he said. Evelyn waited, his voice lowered slightly. This place to stay gentle just because it feels that way right now. Evelyn understood what he meant. Life here would still be hard, work would still be heavy, loneliness would still exist in quiet moments, but she also understood something else. So would belonging. She looked out across the ranch again before answering. I didn't need it to be gentle, she said quietly. I just need it to be real. That seemed to settle something in him. Not fix it, just settle it. Inside the house, a clock chimed softly, marking the hour. Somewhere far off, cattle moved slowly across the pasture, and for the first time since she had arrived, Evelyn didn't feel like she was waiting for her life to start again. She felt like it already had. Wyatt finally spoke, again, his voice quieter than before. This thing, then it was a question this time. Evelyn nodded. Yes. Wyatt away toward the fields, exhaling slowly. All right, he said softly. Then we do this right. Evelyn turned toward him slightly. Do what right? Wyatt looked back at her, and for the first time there was something almost unguarded in his expression. Build something that doesn't fall apart when the weather changes, he said. The words weren't romantic. They were practical. But somehow they meant everything. Evelyn nodded once. I think I can do that. Wyatt gave a faint, almost imperceptible nod in return, and in that quiet morning light, standing on a weathered porch in the middle of a wide Texas ranch, two tired people made a decision that wasn't about escaping their past, but finally staying long enough to build something real. That afternoon, Brooks Ranch felt different, in a way no one could quite point to directly, but everyone seemed to notice. The ranch hands noticed it first, though none of them said it out loud in any serious way. Earl joked that the coffee tasted less tragic than usual, and another worker claimed the fences looked less likely to collapse out of spite. Laughter followed both comments, but it lingered a little longer than usual, like even humor had become more comfortable inside the old ranch house. Wyatt noticed it too, but for him it wasn't in the noise, it was in the stillness. The way the house no longer felt like it was waiting for something missing to return. Evelyn Carter was in the kitchen when he came back from the south pasture, sleeves rolled up, flour dust on her wrists, moving through preparation for dinner with a quiet confidence that had slowly replaced the hesitation she carried during her first days there. The smell of onions, garlic, and slow-simmering beef filled the air, warm enough to push back the chill that still lingered in the walls from the night before. She didn't look up immediately when he entered. "You late," she said casually, stirring the pot. Wyatt set his gloves down near the door. "Fence line gave us trouble again." Evelyn nodded. "I left you a plate in the oven." That simple sentence hit him harder than it should have, not because of the food, but because someone had expected him back. Wyatt moved toward the counter, slowly watching her as she worked. There was something steady about her movements now that hadn't been there when she first arrived. Back then, everything she did carried hesitation, like she was waiting for permission to exist in the space she occupied. Now, she moved like someone who understood she belonged in the room. It unsettled him in a quiet, complicated way. Not because he didn't want it, because he wasn't used to it lasting. He leaned against the counter. "You've been quiet today," he said. Evelyn glanced at him briefly. "I've been busy, that's not what I mean," she paused, then finally turned slightly toward him. "I know," she said softly. A silence stretched between them, familiar now in a way that no longer felt empty. Wyatt looked down at the floor for a moment before speaking again. "You ever think about what happens after this?" he asked. Evelyn didn't pretend not to understand. "After what this?" he said, gesturing vaguely toward the kitchen, the house, the ranch beyond the walls, when it stops feeling new, when it just becomes normal. Evelyn turned back to the stove, stirring slowly. "I think that's the point," she said. Wyatt frowned slightly. "What is normal?" she said. "Most of my life. I only knew chaos or survival. Normal is supposed to feel strange at first." Wyatt let out a quiet breath. "That does to make it easier." "No," Evelyn agreed, "but it makes it real." The words settled between them. Real Wyatt had built his life around real things: fences, cattle, weatherland that didn't lie. But emotional real had always been harder to define, harder to trust. He watched her quietly for a moment. "You ever regret staying?" he asked. Evelyn didn't hesitate this time. "No." The simplicity of the answer surprised him. She set the spoon down and finally looked him fully. "Do you?" she asked. Wyatt didn't answer immediately, because the truth was complicated. He had spent years building a life that required no one. A life where absence could have hurt him again because he never let presence get too close. And now presence was everywhere. In the kitchen, in the mornings, in the sound of someone humming while washing dishes, in her. Finally, he shook his head slightly. "No," he said quietly. That single word changed something in the air again. Not dramatically, but enough. That evening, the ranch gathered for dinner earlier than usual, because a storm system was expected overnight. The sky outside had already begun shifting into deep shades of gray and steel blue, clouds stacking thick on the horizon like something heavy approaching. Evelyn worked faster than usual, plating food with practiced ease as the ranch hands filed in, shaking off dust and tension from the day. The kitchen filled quickly with familiar noise: boots hitting wood floors, chairs scraping, voices overlapping in tired conversation. But beneath it, there was something else now: comfort. Earl leaned back in his chair after the first bite of stew. "I'm not saying this is the best meal I've ever had," he said loudly, "but I am strongly considering moving into this kitchen permanently." Laughter erupted around the table. Wyatt even let out a short, quiet laugh, something he rarely did openly before Evelyn arrived. Evelyn noticed, and smiled slightly without saying anything. After dinner, the storm finally broke over the ranch. Wind slammed against the house, rain pouring down in thick sheets that blurred the windows and turned the outside world into moving shadows. The ranch hands left quickly this time, less talkative, more focused on getting back safely before roads turned worse. Soon only Wyatt and Evelyn remained again. The kitchen lights flickered slightly as thunder rolled across the land. Evelyn stood by the sink rinsing dishes while Wyatt checked the locks on the doors and windows out of habit. "You always this careful during storms?" she asked without turning around. Wyatt paused. "Always? Does it help?" He considered that for a moment. "No," he admitted. "But it's what I know how to do." Slightly. "That makes sense." A flash of lightning lit the room briefly, casting sharp shadows across the walls before fading back into warm lamplight. Wyatt leaned against the counter. "Afterward, you've changed this place," he said quietly. Evelyn glanced at him. "I just cooked." "That's not what I mean," he replied. She turned off the water and faced him fully then. "What do you mean?" Wyatt hesitated, because this part was harder to explain than anything he had said before. Finally, he said, "This place feels like it remembers how to breathe again." The words hung in the kitchen, soft but heavy. Evelyn didn't respond right away. Instead, she looked around the room at the worn table, at the warm light, at the rain pressing against the windows, then back at him. "Maybe it was never broken," she said quietly. "Maybe it was just waiting." Wyatt studied her for a long moment, and then for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel like he was standing alone inside his own life. He felt like someone had finally stepped into it and stayed. This story exists within the realm of fiction, where imagination shapes reality. Any similarities to real-life individuals, organizations, or events are entirely coincidental. The author does not endorse or represent any real entity through the content of this work.
In the quiet stretch of land known as Brooks Ranch, where the wind moves through the fields like an old memory and every sunrise feels like a second chance, this story is not just about survival, it is about transformation. At its heart, this Western romance is about two people who never planned to heal each other. Evelyn Carter arrives with nothing but exhaustion, uncertainty, and the weight of a life spent barely holding on. Wyatt Brooks, on the other hand, carries a different kind of pain, the kind that doesn't show on the surface, the kind built from loss, silence, and years of learning how to live without emotional attachment. What begins as a simple agreement, work in exchange for shelter, slowly becomes something far deeper. Not because of dramatic promises or instant love, but because of small, quiet moments of humanity. A warm meal shared at a wooden table, a door left unlocked without fear, a conversation that doesn't demand perfection, only honesty. The true meaning of this story lies in those moments. It reminds us that healing is not loud. It does not arrive suddenly or dramatically. Instead, it grows slowly in safe spaces, in respectful relationships, and in environments where people are allowed to simply exist without judgment. The moral lesson is clear. Every person carries unseen struggles, and kindness does not require fixing someone. It requires understanding them. Real strength is not in emotional isolation, but in allowing others to stand beside you when life becomes heavy. This story also teaches that home is not just a physical place. It is a feeling of being seen, accepted, and valued without conditions. Sometimes, the most broken hearts do not need saving. They need stability, patience, and time. And finally, it reminds us that love in its truest form is not possession or escape. It is choice. The choice to stay, the choice to understand, and the choice to rebuild something real, even when the past says it is easier to walk away. In the end, Brooks Ranch becomes more than land and walls. It becomes a symbol of human connection, resilience, and the quiet power of choosing each other. One ordinary day at a time.